Thank you for listening to my presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about post-memory in the fiction of Abe Kobo and Woman in the Dunes and Boxman. Marianne Hirsch states that post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, to experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up, end quote. Stephen Frosch states that, quote, everything happens later than it should. The actual experience is missed, yet still remains, not as a memory, but as some kind of an event, end quote. Eva Hoffman asks questions about our reckoning of the Holocaust, even though we have never witnessed it. Quote, how should we then, from our distance, apprehend it? What meanings does the Holocaust hold for us today? And how are we going to pass on those meanings to subsequent generations, end quote. I would like you to hold on to these questions as you listen to my presentation. But instead of looking at the Holocaust, let's turn our sights to Asia to consider what traumatic wartime experiences mean to us. Let me tell you two stories today. And while I tell you these stories and you listen to my presentation, remember to think about how how to look at the experiences of others from a distance, what these experiences mean to us today, and how we're going to pass on such experiences to others. The first story is set in China, late 1945. It's about a young man named Kimifusa. He is 21 years old. He is Japanese, but has lived nearly all of his life in an outpost of the Japanese Empire in Mukden, Manchuria, modern-day Xinjiang. This is an advertisement for Manchuria at that time. And this is the extent of the Japanese Empire. And you can see Manchukuo. The young man had been in Tokyo where he was studying to be a doctor, but he was contacted to return to Mukden at once. His father, a doctor, has just died, and his mother is all alone. Russia is advancing from the north. Soon the Japanese military will be defeated, and the young man and his mother will be homeless and surviving on whatever they can. They are lucky to escape China, but the Japanese Empire is finished, with bombs on Hiroshima and 3 days later Nagasaki. The Tokyo that the young man and his mother have returned to is also leveled by firebombing. The city is completely destroyed. This young man eventually gets his medical degree, but he never practices. Instead, he publishes literature and goes on to become one of Japan's most famous post-war writers. He is Abe Kobo, the Kafka of Japan. I will talk to you about post-memory and how it is apparent in two of Abe's works. I'd like to thank Zita Husing for introducing me to post-memory. This is a protagonist of Woman in the Dunes. He's about to escape his hole. A man crosses over into a surreal world of people living an absurd existence in sand dunes. He's a school teacher, a hobby bug collector, and budding entomologist. He gets kidnapped by the community and held hostage in the bottom of a pit. He is forced to live with a widow and shovel sand from sundown to sunrise each day to keep the house standing. It is an absurd existence, but once the man is faced with freedom, he chooses to remain in the community because he realizes that his old life is even more absurd than his new one. One of the main themes of Woman in the Dunes is about how science and technology can change our perceptions of society as much as they can change society. The protagonist of Woman in the Dunes invents an incredible device to extract water from the sand. He saves the community by doing so, but it is in his sharing of the news of his invention with the community that he is finally made to feel a part of it. How does Woman in the Dunes help us learn about the tragedies of World War II that Abe experienced firsthand? It was a hopeless existence for the Japanese under the empire. Everyone had a role, and they could not change it. Men were put first in everything. At the dinner table, when walking, Japan conquered their neighbors, and then they were conquered. After the war, they had to rebuild society, much like the society in Woman in the Dunes. They were shoveling sand each night. Sand is a symbol of a desolate landscape, of a Japan destroyed by the war. It was not until after the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, nearly 2 decades after the end of the war, that Japan finally began to modernize. Woman in the Dunes was published in 1962, and the film came out in 1964. The novel's depiction of a man wandering into a surreal world that can only be described as fantasy is an allegory of the everyman in Japanese society who is literally forced from one existence to another. His identity is changed. In many ways, it is the death of the self and a reincarnation, a new life. The woman at the bottom of the pit, the woman in the dunes, is also transformed. She lost her husband and child in a sandstorm, and she represents the lost humanity, the lost lives, and the culture that is lost as the sands change, as the time changes, as the war comes to a close, as Japan reinvents itself as a modern society. This is a scan from my copy of the book, and you can see where I've marked this passage with N and A. N stands for Nikki, the protagonist's name. A is for Abe, the writer. So in this section of the book, Abe, the writer, is questioning his protagonist. Well, Nikki, I'm amazed. At last you have decided to write something. It really was the experience that made you. A common earthworm won't attain full growth if it's not stimulated, they say. Thanks. Actually, I've got to think up some kind of title. What kind, I wonder? The Devil of the Sands? Or the Terrors of an Anthill? They show a terrible taste for the bizarre. Don't they give much too insincere an impression? Do you think so? It's meaningless, no matter how intense the experience, to trace only the surface of the event. The heroes of this tragedy are the local boys, and if you don't give some hint of the solution by describing them, your rare experience will be lost. So this book was widely popular in 1962. Abe won the Akutagawa Literary Prize for it, the equivalent of a Pulitzer or Booker. Japanese might read it as a man being reeled in by a woman, giving up his freedom to a partner. It might mean that today to those who read it, but the narrative tells the story of World War II from a distance. Men are taken and then buried. This particular passage reveals the inner dialogue that must have taken place inside the heads of those who lived in the two worlds of Japan, the empire and the one they started to rebuild. Dying is, of course, a kind of transformation. First of all, the skin suddenly pales, then the nose thins, and the jaw withers and gets smaller. The half-open mouth resembles the edge of a tangerine skin, cut open with a knife, and the red, artificial teeth of the lower jaw begin to jut out from the opening. Further, even the clothes that are being worn change. What appeared to be of very high quality turns before one's eyes into cheap goods, showy but worthless. When you look at it from within, it's a labyrinth of 100 interconnecting puzzle rings. The more you struggle, the more the box, like an extra outer skin growing from the body, creates new twists for the labyrinth. A man decides to live in a box that he puts over his body in order to roam around Tokyo incognito. The box is a physical divide between the reader and the text, between Abe, the artist, and Abe, the young boy caught between two worlds, Mukden and his native Japan, between his life in society as a future doctor and his life as an avant-garde writer, a citizen of the Empire of Japan and a homeless refugee in his own country. It is difficult to explain Boxman. There are no words, you must read it. An eye that simply looked, quote, an eye that simply looked expressionless, an insolent eye that forced on me the role of being seen, but of not seeing. I wonder when he learned such a technique. It goes without saying that the model was myself. I was depressed. I was being seen, but was the one seen too. End quote. No matter how hard the boxman tries to escape from being seen, he is always there as other. His interests lie not in what is inside the box himself, but in outside, specifically what he wants to focus on. Is he self-aware and interested in others, or is he trying to escape his lack of self-awareness? The box lets us choose what to focus on. The box also lets us show the world only our soul. After a war, if we survive it, it is often the only thing we have left, our soul. Our things are gone. Our bodies have likely changed, reshaped, parts taken away. Boxman tells us that no matter how much we hide of ourselves, we can never hide our soul. No matter what we choose to focus on or turn away from, that world will always be there waiting for us, looking at us. Even when we try to kill it, it will survive and we will become it. Boxman warned post-war generations of Japanese and future generations to not forget the past. No matter how far we think we get away from it, we always bring ourselves and perhaps the selves that came before us. There's one more story to tell, and this second story is something more personal. It is my main impetus to learn more about post-memory and what brings me here today. I'd like to tell you about another boy, this one 12 years younger than Abe was when he experienced perhaps his most traumatic event. Interestingly, they were both born in the same Chinese year of the rat, Abe in 1924, and this young man in 1936. And both were born in Asia, this one living in Manila at the same time in 1945 when he was 9 years old. He had arrived to Manila from the provinces with his two older sisters in 1942, just after Japan invaded his hometown and murdered his older brother and father during fighting. His mother died soon after of heartbreak, so the three youngsters took a boat to Manila during the invasion and amazingly survived. They arrived at their late mother's brother's house, where they lived during the Japanese occupation. The young boy tired of his uncle's beatings and took to the streets of Manila. There he lived in boxes, stealing food whenever he could. One day he stole bread, and a Japanese soldier ordered him to stop. He kept running. He was shot in the foot, but got away. His life didn't change when the Japanese surrendered. He remained on the streets, living next to the docks, until an American ship captain allowed him onto the ship. There's more to this story, but the boy ends up in New Orleans and eventually becomes an American citizen in 1976 when I was just 5 years old. That young boy from Manila was my father. He never really talked. Um, he never really talked about his experiences in the provinces or in Manila. But from what I remember is that he witnessed his father and brother hanging from a tree and seeing his mother die. We went back in 1998 and could not find their graves nor his sisters. I finally found them in 2014, a year after he died. One was still alive. My father was haunted by the ghosts of his past. They would invade our house and reside in the bedroom where the lights remained on all night. My father was an alcoholic and left our family, my sisters, my mother, everything in disarray. In many ways, I have inherited his ghosts. At 52, I have finally learned how to keep these shadows in the light, perhaps having kept the ghosts at bay. It is in these shadows of my father that I recognize the worlds of Abe Kobo. I asked you at the beginning to think about how to look at the experiences of others from a distance, what it means to us today, and how we're going to pass on such experiences to others. In many ways, the worlds of Abe Kobo and that of my father intersect. In 1998, 45 years since my father left the Philippines, he returned. He showed me the docks where he lived in a box. Abe's protagonist navigates the streets of Tokyo, the ones that Abe witnessed at the end of the war. In a box, he's protected from the world around him, free to move and see what he wants to see, when he wants, and for how long. In this way, Abe's fiction frames a traumatic experience not only for Japanese people, but for anyone with post-memories. Frost states that traumatic experience, he states that traumatic experiences are held to be too overpowering to be grasped as they occur. So instead, they're somehow gone through without being properly processed. Only later on, if it becomes possible, to think about them in a calmer way, with more perspective or distance, end quote. How much more distance is required to go through the experiences of World War II for the Japanese? It is difficult to calculate, but it is through literature, reframing the past, that we're able to gain a clear perspective of how such experiences overpowered the generation that first held them. Frost states that it is society, quote, the social conditions, end quote, that are responsible for dealing with the ghosts of the past, those shadows, not the individuals who find themselves reckoning with the past. In this way, literature as a collective treasure of society can be beneficial as the chosen tool of reckoning with the past and reshaping the future.